Hello and welcome to this Forum for Philosophy event at the LSE. My name is Danielle Sands and I'm a fellow at the Forum. I'm going to be chairing this evening's event in which we are asking what's wrong with rights. The idea of human rights has become foundational in our legal system. Rights also bridge morality and politics and underpin our sense of what it means to be human. But where do rights come from? Can non-human beings have rights? And what does the rights model reinforce individualism? In our discussion this evening, we will consider the advantages and limitations of the rights model and ask if we can think philosophically, ethically, and politically beyond rights. Let me introduce our speakers for this evening. Adam Etinson is Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at the University of St Andrews. Yoriko Otomo is Lecturer in Law at SOAS University of London. And Lyndsey Stonebridge is Professor of Humanities and Human Rights at the University of Birmingham. There'll be lots of time for questions at the end, so if you do have questions, please add them to the chat. Now, Lyndsey, I wonder if you can start things off for us. What are human rights and where do they come from?
Thank you, Danielle, and it's great to be here. I'm really very pleased to be talking, especially with Adam and Yoriko, people I know and haven't had a chance to talk to before. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming. So what are human rights? Well, all cultures and societies have and do operate on value systems, which are based on the relationships between people and between gods and animals and things. That's kind of, always been the case. And many religions and cultures have had a very strong sense of what's sacred or immutable, those sort of qualities that are no-touch qualities that govern how we interact together. Modern human rights, in the sense that we tend to talk about today, have several different origins. And I'll just quickly do a little map. The first one is legal history, is the legal context. And you get the beginning of something like human rights. You get the framework for human rights way back in the 17th century when we had the development of international laws on trade and war. So rights and war have a very close history together, and indeed with capitalism and trade. So from the 17th century on, you've got these sort of frameworks which are governing how nation states can behave, or not how different sovereign entities can behave in relationship to one another whilst guaranteeing sovereignty. So that's important, because if you didn't have that sense of laws operating internationally, the sense of human rights as being a sort of extra-territorial, extra-sovereign place would not be in place. But later on, you have at the same time the development of European Enlightenment thinking about the individual. Crucially in this story is Immanuel Kant and his concepts around human dignity. And I'm really interested to hear Adam on this as well, because Adam, I know you've done some really interesting work on the concept of dignity recently. So Kant's idea that there was something intrinsically about human dignity that we had to respect, something about not treating each other as a means to an end, just of course as people were. We're talking about the origins of colonialism here as well, just as that was happening. And you had very growing ideas about natural rights, about rights that belonged to men, not just to sovereigns, not just to kings, but to, and it was mainly white men. Now, this all sounds very promising, and a lot of those ideas filter in to our concepts of rights today. But it's also crucial to note where the history and rights are interacting and wrapping themselves around each other. A lot of ideas around natural rights and the sentiment that you should be respectful of other people's dignity, respectful of other people's rights, moral sentiments developed in response to and out of the origins of capitalism, which can be both a good thing and a bad thing, and it actually tend to move between one another. So when Adam Smith writes about moral sentiments, he's actually saying, if you're going to have a system which is based on markets and competition, you're going to have something to stop people ripping each other apart, like Hobbes predicted. And one of the answers to this was the development about ideas of sympathy and moral sentiment. As I always say to my students, the original virtue signalers were 18th century capitalists. They were the first ones to signal their virtue as a way of saying, I am a good man. This is my virtue. at a time when market forces and those very good men could also be, of course, slave owners. So that's one thing to know. But the other bit of that story is the way that human rights have always been linked to insurgent or revolutionary moments with self-determination, with ideas about democracy, with challenges to power. And that side of the story really comes into being with the French Revolution and with the American Revolution. So those are sort of prehistory, the prehistory of now coordinates. And what you see is those sort of ideas about dignity, self-determination, democracy, the right to be heard, being carried over into what I call the second age of rights, which came after World War II, after imperialism, capitalism, and all the ideas about natural dignity and the Great Enlightenment Project fell apart, were resuscitated in that second great moment of rights, which came after World War II with the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. So that's a very rapid and broad kind of set of coordinates for what the kind of ideas and histories that are percolating when we talk about rights now.
Thanks, Lyndsey. That was a really useful sort of potted history, I think, for us. Yoriko, Adam, do you want to add anything into that history before we move on?
Sure. Yeah, well, thank you, Lyndsey. I thought that was a fascinating start, and I like the starting distinction that Lyndsey made between the legal history of rights and the moral history of rights. So I was thinking, just one of the questions we were meant to ponder is, how long have rights been around? Where do they come from? And I think if we're talking about the legal history of rights, we need to be thinking about the sorts of things that Lyndsey was talking about. But if we think of rights simply as a moral concept, as an idea of being owed certain things, whether these are possessions, whether these are freedoms, whether these are displays of respect or deference, that, it seems to me, must be a very old thing. So I can only imagine that that's been around for a very long time. Like, as soon as human beings had political structures, you'd imagine, as soon as some people were given, special entitlements to issue orders or to receive benefits or to make decisions, you already have the germ of a right there, the idea that certain individuals are owed certain things from others. Once you have agriculture, you have a reason for people to sort of want to have exclusive access to the fruits of their labors, the work that they put into certain tracts of land. And so you'd have the germ of a situation where you might have claims to that land. And of course, that's going to go back very far into human history. So I just think if we're talking about the moral history of rights, we're probably reaching well back beyond recorded history, I would think. So that's just a small addendum I would add to Lyndsey's comments.
Yeah, and I guess to add to that too, when we're talking about the history of human rights, I think it's the history of humanism itself is kind of inextricably linked with that. And so, the long history of humanism is the question of what a human is, the conflict between human and nature, man and man, existence and being, individual and species. And while we think of it as a timeless or universal concept, it's a historical and ideological myth that reaches its zenith in the late 19th century, which Lyndsey alludes to. So to add to Lyndsey's story about how it emerges, how this idea of human rights emerges with capitalism and really the great colonial projects, what we have is the idea of humanness as being consolidated in Western Europe at a time of tremendous territorial and existential upheaval in the mid-17th century. And it emerges as governmental rhetoric. So if we're thinking about humanism and in relation to governance, it emerges as governmental rhetoric to reassure populations that the sovereign state is the political authority empowered to rule on the basis that humans are human, as opposed to the church, which rules on the basis that humans are subjects of God. And so that's really interesting to start with when we start talking. We'll talk a bit later about animal rights. And so I guess the story of humanism is not completely illustrious, and in fact, there's a scholar called Tony Davis, who calls it empire humanism. He says it's an ideology that tracks the modern age, and it's held in thrall to these ideas of whiteness and masculinity as its reference points, particularly in relation to governing, yeah, so for its authority, and so it's not completely straightforward. Maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks, Yoriko. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's come out in what you're saying and what Lyndsey was saying, is that actually, this is a very complex set of histories, and we think that human rights are on the surface something good generally, but they seem to have emerged from these very complex set of histories and be attached to all sorts of complex desires and impulses, which are not always good. I suppose, can we detach human rights as a good thing from those histories, or do those histories and the complexities of those histories and that entanglement with the problematic history of humanism always keep emerging in these discourses of human rights? Yoriko?
Should I come in?
Yeah, so I don't know. So after World War II, you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that declares slavery as being a violation of human rights. And yet you also have the Jewish Holocaust that was carried out shortly before that as an ode, really, to a very narrow form of humanism. So certainly, rights discourse has historically been used at times to service nationalistic and even fascistic policy. And it's really difficult to separate this out from an essentialist idea of legal rights, because when we're talking about legal rights, what is that if not discourse as well? It's possible, of course, to refer to examples where rights are a kind of rallying cry for good causes. So there's the women's vote, the abolition of slavery, decolonization, and so on. But when we're using, say, the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, I find that we keep ending up in this kind of slippery mess when we try to expand rights claims to more humans and non-humans, which I can say more about that later. But I'm sure Lyndsey, who's done so much work on this, has a lot to say as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Danielle, but I think it's a sort of question academics ask themselves, isn't it? So we could just disentangle the history from the praxis of politics. Wouldn't it be great? It would, but unfortunately, the philosopher kings do not rule. And so I think I think you have to live with the ambivalence of that history. And I kind of want to defend rights at this point. I mean, in terms of the legal framework that is there, because they have given. If you look at something like the UDHR, but also more importantly, the Human Rights Commission, it did allow, especially sort of post-Bandung, emerging post-colonial countries to put apartheid down, put as a crime against humanity. I mean, and that was really helpful. So I think, I also think people will rally to rights in a way that they're not going to rally around ideologies. And at certain points, that has proved, and you're quite right, at certain points it's proved disastrous, but at other points it's proved profitable. Another type of politics has emerged. So I kind of want to keep, I think there is a kind of version of rights which is very liberal. There's a version of rights which is very conservative. There's a version of rights which just has got its history stuck all over it. But there's also an insurgent version of rights, which I think is kind of in the structure of rights history itself. So whilst in some ways, we might want to wash our hands, I want to keep the place open for that insurgency.
Thanks, Lyndsey. Adam, do you want to come in and perhaps also defend rights, I suspect?
Yeah, well, I think that's I'm like Lyndsey. I think an optimist about rights. I think a lot depends on how we cash out, our understanding of what rights we have, how we use rights. I think these are the important things, and I'm an optimist that we can sort of rescue rights from their problematic history at times. So in terms of a broader defense, I think I know we're supposed to come to that a little bit later in the panel discussion. So maybe I'll just say that for now.
Great. I mean, I wonder whether we could think a bit more about who has rights and where they come from. So we've talked about the history a little bit, but are rights something we're born with? Are rights something that we receive by being members of certain communities? Can you maybe come back to that a little bit, Adam?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it all depends on how we define human rights. So I mean, usually we think of human rights as a subset of the larger class of rights. So we might have certain special rights that we acquire through membership in a certain community or through certain achievements, like the President of the United States has a special right to veto Congress. That's not a right most people have. Of course, no one but the president can have that right. So we wouldn't want to call that a human right. But human rights are those rights, as I understand it, that all human beings have, and also that all human beings have in some naturalistic sense, that it just comes prepackaged with their being human. So that's how I would sort of urge us to think of human rights. Now, it's difficult to sort of, so we might say, okay, that's how, if you're disposed to think of human rights in that way, fine. And you might say, okay, where do they come from, right? Why do human beings just have these sort of inborn entitlements? And I think that's a very difficult question to answer, and that any answer you give is probably going to be less satisfying than this sort of profound conviction that we have that people do have these rights universally. So, and of course, many answers have been given. We might look at species membership as somehow a rights granting feature of human beings, or the capacity for reason, as Lyndsey mentioned. Kant was very much impressed by our capacity for reason, and that's where our dignity came from, and they're from our rights. It may be our basic needs that somehow grant us these rights, our interests in certain things. All of these answers have different problems with them, and I think it's sort of important to sort of search for an answer. But I'm more certain that we have rights than I am in any answer about why we do. And I think that's something that relaxes me. I don't feel as worried about the absence of some kind of foundational answer there. So I mean, that's my 2 cents as a conceptual orientation here.
Lyndsey, perhaps we could come back to you.
Yeah, no, I was just dwelling on Adam's really lovely formulation, which is, I'm more certain that we have human rights than I am about the accounts of why we have human rights, which I thought was brilliant, because it does sort of speak to that moment where there is a sense, and it's usually it usually comes from their deprivation. I can remember when years ago when I was a Twitter in Twitter kindergarten and didn't know what I was doing, putting something critical about human rights, and I didn't get trolled. The opposite of what a troll, a fairy, said, "How dare you say there are no human rights?" And then when I looked at this person, this person really went for me, and it came from a context where he was really campaigning in a structure where he didn't think there was something like human rights, and it didn't behold me to say, "Oh, actually, what you're talking about there is legal or political rights." Actually, I think you're talking about economic rights. Because his very strong sense was that something was being withheld from him. But I do think we do go into a problem here, which is just, Adam's quite right. And I think this touches on the histories of humanism that Yoriko has talked about as well, is if you kind of bracket out human rights and say, well, there are other rights that might be more important, like political rights, national rights, civic rights, all those things don't, in the end, give protection. So we really are sort of history has shown that, you know, being a member of a nation state means nothing if you can be decitizenized. You know, political rights mean nothing if you can be imprisoned for your political beliefs. And I always go back here to Hannah Arendt's very enigmatic and irritatingly undeveloped concept of the right to have rights. And it's important to remember the context that she came out of, which she thought about this, which was she was writing, she wrote in 1949, first of all, about the right to have rights. When she was writing The Origins of Totalitarianism, she was, of course, a stateless person. And she was very critical of, she was very critical of human rights, actually. She was very critical of the natural rights tradition, not least because she, as she says, you know, it's quite obvious, as she was writing in the 40s, that she said the world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. So the world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being humanism. So that kind of natural rights-based humanism was no protection at all. And she started her analysis with the analysis of stateless people to say, well, if you can be rendered stateless, if the sovereign state is so important for guaranteeing your rights, then you're rightless, you have nothing. And she pointed out that the response to that in the post-war period, as Yoriko was saying, was, yes, of course, there was lots of legislation, lots of very fine ideas about human rights, but most people who were rightless at the time were not calling for human rights. They were calling for something like a nation state and political rights. So that they were not saying, where are my human rights? They were saying, you know, where am I going to live? Where can I have civil rights? Where can I have political rights? But if you look at what Arendt says, she says the right to have rights is the right to just speak and appear. And she doesn't say it's the right to have national rights, although you could think she's saying that. She doesn't actually say it's the right to have political rights, although you could assume she's saying that too. Quite often we say she's talking about the right to appear in a political community, which she kind of is, but she doesn't really use the word democracy either. She's not talking about, you know, representative right. She's actually talking more very loosely about the principle of equal liberty, where people have the right to speech and to engage with what it is that we are bestowing upon one another when we talk about the right to have rights. So Etienne Balibar, who's written, the philosopher, Marxist philosopher, has written beautifully about this aspect of Arendt's work, will say that there is a kind of, yes, there's an anthropological, you know, she's being anthropological. The right to speak is the right for us to describe or give one another a sense of the humanness to which we are then giving rights. Because what that humanness might be has to be something that comes out of relationships between people, rather than the isolated sort of individualists who are claiming their rights based on prior rights around property or wealth claims. So I do think, you know, yes, I want to keep human rights, but not unproblematically, but always be aware that as soon as we're in that space, we have to invent other ways of thinking about how politically and ethically we live together, which might not be the nation state and might not be political forms that we currently inhabit, or might not even be, you know, anthropological forms that we currently inhabit.
Thanks, Lyndsey. Yoriko, you're nodding. Do you want to comment there?
Oh, well, just to agree with Lyndsey that, you know, it's just lovely to think of alternative ways of being in community together and you know, to be supportive and so on. And these are just wonderful sentiments with which I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's still quite problematic to think about it in terms of the language of human rights, and not just the language, but the legal structures of human rights, which is what essentially you're referring to when well, I think as a legal scholar, you know, human rights refers to this kind of complex web of national and international laws and very specific procedural claims often that are made in the name of human rights. And so and that comes along with all of it necessarily, I think, drags along its historical problems with it. You know, at its heart, the idea of human rights is a kind of magic circle. Adam, you were saying, well, I don't, you know, I can't say for sure whether we've got them, but we do have them. I believe we have them. And it's that leap of faith that you're talking about that we need to make in order to surmount this kind of existential crisis of being in a world without God. And we've been sitting in this crisis for the past century, at least as a global community, or at least in the global north. And it's very, very tricky to talk about these things too in a globalized world where there are many now competing discourses, religious, ethical, and so on, very dramatically different from the sort of language of international law that we're familiar with in the post-war period. That's really crafted by the Allied states. And so I do think, Lyndsey, there are different ways of being and ways of flourishing that we have to keep working on for the good of the public, to keep trying to imagine and extend ourselves to imagine ways of governing ourselves to be. But nonetheless, I'm not sure that human rights is the best way forward in the long term. And that's what I'd have to say about the language of animal rights as well. You know, it's so useful in terms of being a rallying cry for people and for communities. But there must be other ways of doing it because there are so many limitations when you start to look at the granular detail of what it means to make those claims themselves. And it's so much more about who isn't able to make those claims. It's such an exclusionary process more often than not, when the people who most need to claim those rights are often the ones who are least able to get them.
Thanks, Yoriko. I mean, I think we've really begun to look at this sort of difficult, problematic history of rights, and you've also now touching on this issue that they can be very exclusionary. Adam, I wonder if you can say a bit more about, what's wrong with rights and why they, given that they have such laudable aims, why they've got such a bad reputation in lots of different kinds of circles.
Yeah, I forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, yes, absolutely. So, yeah, it's an interesting title that we have for the panel discussion today. What's wrong with rights? So it suggests that there's some uncertainty about what it is exactly that is wrong with rights, but no uncertainty at all that there is something wrong with rights. And so I just want to,
dispute that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I just want to confess that I'm a little bit less certain that there is something wrong with rights as such, technically understood, and abstractly understood, right? So apart from various histories. So I think if you think about them abstractly, rights seem to me to be a necessary component of any sane morality or system of law. So without rights, we couldn't claim to be owed certain things as a matter of strict urgency, right? Even when it might be inconvenient, even when it might be disadvantageous for others. So for instance, we wouldn't be able to claim an indissoluble human right not to be tortured, even in horrific cases where public fury at an offender might call for that sort of thing. We wouldn't be able to claim an indissoluble right to housing, healthcare, basic subsistence, even when the state or other agencies find such things expensive or inconvenient. We wouldn't be able to claim a basic right to vote or run for office, regardless of whether or not this would in some sense contribute to the collective good. So like having a right to something is like having a kind of shield. It's like a way of brushing aside concerns about the inefficiency, cost, or collective inconvenience of having that thing, whether it's a freedom, whether it's a good, whether it's some kind of service. And so understood in that way, I think rights are useful for individuals, they're useful for minorities, they're useful for whole peoples on the international stage. They're a very useful tool for the powerless in the face of the powerful. And so it's hard not to see the appeal of rights language and rights discourse in that sense, I think. And that's true so far as I can tell, no matter what your political ideology is. So I think it's tempting for any ideology to sort of use or co-opt the language of rights because it's an appealing concept and a powerful concept. So of course, the political right will use the language of rights to ensure the supremacy of the free market, championing some kind of absolute unqualified right to free exchange. But also, the left makes use of the language of rights, even though Marx himself was critical of rights discourse. Labor rights, rights to unionize, rights to welfare, rights to unemployment protection, unemployment insurance, rights to good working conditions, to paid leave, universal basic income. Many of those rights are in the Universal Declaration, as Lyndsey was talking about before. So I think it's great and we have to think critically about rights, especially given their dominance. So when a language is so dominant, you have to be suspicious of it, and you have to criticize it and be wary and be critical. But I'm not so sure that the problem here, if there is a problem, and of course there are problems, I'm not so sure that the problem is with rights themselves. So I think the problems emerge with how we use rights, how we use rights discourse. So one problem, and we could go on and on, but let me just mention one. There is a problem with making every moral, political, and legal issue an issue of rights. So just take morality, for instance. So living morally, engaging in moral life is a very complex, nuanced affair. There are many components to it. And there's a lot of our moral life that is simply not covered or captured by the language of rights. So think about virtues, moral virtues. Like I want to be a charitable person. I want to be a generous person, a kind person, someone who acts with integrity, loyalty. Part of that involves respecting the rights of others. But you can't reduce the moral virtues entirely to the task of respecting rights. No one has a right that I be kind or generous or nice, or friendly to them, but those are crucial parts of morality and of being moral. Much of doing well by others, of being moral, involves going above and beyond duty, or what's strictly speaking owed to other people as a matter of right. So think of being a good neighbor. It's not just a matter of like respecting the fence between or the barrier, or the wall, between you and your neighbor, but of going out of your way to be considerate to your neighbor. Maybe calling, if a child falls ill, or writing a message, or maybe going well above and beyond baking a cake for your neighbor. These are the things that are at issue there. So, and when you hear appeals to rights, that's usually a sign that relations have degraded, in some way to some kind of base level. So I think you lose a lot of the texture and interest of our moral lives just to focus on morality if you make everything about respecting rights. And sometimes there are great causes, huge moral and political causes like we're facing climate change, for instance. Some of these causes might not be well framed in terms of the language of rights. So if you think of the case of climate change, we might ask, who is it that has a right against indifference to climate change? Certainly young people, future generations, you would think, but of course they don't exist. Why not just think of this as, the avoidance of climate change, the prevention of climate change is an absolutely imperative goal that we have to pursue as human beings, rather than anyone's right, per se. And a goal can be just as urgent as any right. So I think at best, rights are a component of morality, they're a component of law, maybe even a small one, some instances. So that's one thing. Don't make everything about rights. Another thing to watch out for, is of course, using rights discourse in unhelpful ways. So it might be that you claim implausible rights. So the idea that we have a limitless right to free exchange and to engage in the market and no other rights or duties to others seems to me highly implausible and outrageous. Can't claim freedom from taxation or renege on our duties to other co-citizens, other human beings when they need help. So that's one problem, right? Making sure we correctly identify the rights that we have. Another issue might be using human rights discourse in ambiguous ways, not clearly defining the sort of practical implications of claiming certain rights. So it is an issue that in human rights discourse, we don't really know who is meant to step in when a state is either unwilling or unable to fulfill the rights of its own citizens. It's just a deep ambiguity in human rights practice, and that's a problem. There's a lacuna in human rights discourse that needs to be remedied for us to understand what its practical implications are. That's a problem, but it's not a problem as I see it with rights as such. It's a problem with the way rights are used by people, whether it's due to overexcitement or enthusiasm or inattention or ideological bias or other things. So when you criticize rights, I think we need to start first by recognizing how critical in some sense rights are to our self-understanding, to our moral and political lives together, no matter what our political ideology is. And also to keep in mind the likelihood that what we're really concerned about is how people are using the idea of rights in their lives and in their speech, rather than the concept of rights itself. So is there anything wrong with rights? Is another way of posing the question that we have to, or one question that we could ask today.
So just to summarize there, Adam, it seems you're saying it's not rights are the problem, it's A, sort of misuses of rights, and B, sort of the reduction of basically all moral and political questions to questions of rights. Is that fair?
Yeah, roughly, yeah. And other mistakes we might make, just sort of misidentifying the rights that we have.
Sure, thank you. I wonder if I could bring in Lyndsey there. Do you agree with those two claims?
Yeah, no, I thought that was fascinating, Adam. I just did want to go back to the legal framework and to question the extent to which it is sort of historically contaminated, which it is. But also, I think some of what Adam's talking about also comes through in that history. And the one that is sort of really playing loudly in my mind at the moment is 1951 Refugee Convention, which of course is its anniversary, and there have been lots of good faith and bad faith accounts of the 51 Convention that have come out of that, not least a questioning of how it's working now. And in some ways you could say, well, it's not working very well at all. I mean, if you look at, the article on non-refoulement, you are not supposed to send people back. It's very, very clear. You couldn't be clearer on this. How the EU, for example, is using its lawyers to work out precisely how to do that by using the law, by precisely using the terms that were given. So that would be a classic case of Yoriko. I think what you're talking about is like, yeah, but look. But if you go back and, when I was doing some work on the 51 Convention a few years ago, go back into the Traité Préparatoire, which is the archive which records all the arguments everyone had. And as a historian, I just know this is catnip to me, about, all the arguments sort of behind the each article. And as a literary historian, it's even more like catnip because you get a real sense of people's histories and characters and fights. On non-refoulement, it was the rear action against that was the British surprise with Saudi Arabia, surprise, who said we can't just must be able to put people back. I mean, what if they're not very nice? I mean, this is literally what the British delegates said. What if we don't want them? And the action against that came from a couple of people who had been refooled, had been pushed back during the war and had lost people. And there was an absolute, it goes back to something Adam said earlier, is that's you're not going to have it. This is wrong. And it's wrong out of, our experience, history. There's a moral line here. And I think those two, the kind of, regressive instrumentalism of human rights law, of course, inhibits. But there's this other thing that you call it, you can call it rage, you can call it hope, you can call it other kind of human virtues that just percolate through. And for that, I think it's fascinating and necessary. I think, Adam, you're absolutely right. And I think the left, and not just the left, but people want to defend human rights, being really bad on not taking seriously why it is other people don't like rights, human rights. The other people don't like human rights because they're horrible and cruel. other people don't like human rights because they're not nice people, which is nothing more, guaranteed to irritate people who are already suspicious of human rights, is to be told that you don't like them and you're suspicious of them because you're horrible. And I think there is something, there's a kind of overreach, there's legalism, all of which, raise, legitimate questions about freedom and jurisdiction that people are kicking back. But I think the other thing, and I think Yoriko is right on this as well, what has to be put in play here is a sense of post-colonial history, is the bleed out into sense that, human rights are a version of humanitarianism, and they're things that you give people who are less fortunate than yourselves. And I don't think, and that gets kind of caught up in historical narratives about deservingness and non-deservingness. So that's that kind of colonial history of humanitarianism, I think, is also at play there. But the other thing I want to put on the table is that question of what it would mean to be have a proper critical response to rights. And I think Adam is doing some really exciting work here, which just doesn't involve either saying it's all rubbish and contaminated and awful, or it's all great and you're all horrible, but moves into that. And I think Adam's quite right. Well, some of that's going to be a holding back on human rights, and particularly a holding back on the kind of discourse that human rights is the new virtue signaling in a world which is in a neoliberal world in which inequalities are extreme. There's no accident that those discourses around moral sentiment, virtue, and human rights tend to appear in historical moments when that the exact opposite is what is actually happening.
I'd like to bring Yoriko back in at this point and come back to this idea of the exclusionary nature of rights, and a point that Adam made about rights being a useful tool for the powerless. I'd like to know if you agree, Yoriko, or maybe you want to sort of add something to that.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, the question that keeps coming to mind is who gets to say what these human rights are. And Adam, you were talking about the different kinds of things that we might like to be rights but aren't. That some of us might like to be rights but aren't. and it's such a very, very big world out there that we're only really now coming to grips with the internet, with this sort of increased communication. And I think there are so many rich cultures that have other discourses about things that, like rights, obligation, family obligation, state obligation, community obligation, that there are so many very different, dramatically different ways of passing that relationship between people or between humans and nature, that I think it would be worthwhile opening up to when doing this kind of work of thinking through what to retain of human rights, post 1945 to today. Yeah, that's human rights, the language of legal rights as it stands today, I think is undoubtedly, it causes as much grief to those excluded as it does give hope. So, when you're in refugee camps or other places where people are desperate, that sort of tremendous sense of disappointment they might feel from having assumed that they have rights and then finding out that they don't, even when they're middle class, even when they had a good home and a life and a state, suddenly they don't. And of course, rights, disappears into the ether. I think that does a tremendous lot of harm to this sense of community, global community. So we must do something about that. One must think a way through that. Yeah.
You reminded me, Yoriko, of Kafka's story, The Castle. And it's Arendt again who points this out, but the castle is, those of you who know the story, is a story of a guy who rocks up at a village at a castle, thinking he's got an offer of work, thinking that someone said, "Oh, I'll have a visa, come and drive our lorry." Actually, it was, come and measure our land, so it has territory in it as well. only to be discovered it's like, what? And everything is all about bureaucracy and admin and pushing him out and actually, saying you were not invited. And Arendt makes the point, and she writes about this in 44, I think it is, that what K does in the castle is behave as if universal human rights do exist, and that's why he's so annoying to everyone in the village, because he just refuses. He is actually, very much like the figure of, certainly the figure of the migrant, but also the figure of the refugee is just like, well, I'm here and I'm just going to keep on behaving in this totally reasonable way. I'm going to be a man of goodwill, and I'm going to assume that you are also men of goodwill. And that's what's so interminable about the story, because it can't move from that position. So your point really reminded me of that. But it's also, I think what I like about Arendt's reading of that is like, it's there as a negative idea in that context, in a society that plays lip service to human rights, but actually has whole systems of bureaucracy and border control and power, which is set up to do it. And I really think that tension is there in contemporary camps, as it is in Kafka. They're not the same, but they're speaking to something very, very similar.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really interesting example. I don't know so much about the case that you were mentioning, but this idea of hope and disappointment, and Lyndsey mentioned sort of paying lip service, sort of understanding as a refugee that the powers that be are only paying lip service to the language of human rights rather than actually complying with it and giving me the rights that I'm supposed to have. I mean, that points to another problem here, which, I mean, maybe the biggest and the most difficult for human rights practitioners, which is the lack of compliance with human rights. So maybe what we all really want, rather than getting rid of human rights, is to make states more compliant with them. And actually, to cease paying lip service to human rights, but to really put their will behind them. I mean, that's just one other way of reacting to that kind of case, Yoriko. But again, I don't know enough about the details to say whether that makes sense as a way of reading it. I was just thinking about also, Lyndsey, you mentioned the importance of holding back, which I think is a good way of putting it. You're not making everything about human rights, not making everything, not thinking of human rights as only workable within the medium of law, for instance. Holding back sometimes, I think, is going to be important. But I think like what I'm sensing from Yoriko and Lyndsey is also just a desire for reimagining things, so opening up our minds as to what human rights can be. You mentioned, Lyndsey, addressing inequality, and it's true that human rights don't do much to address gaping inequalities, global inequalities in wealth. The language is structured so that we're meant to bring up, the worst off to a certain level of adequate well-being, but there's nothing in human rights to prevent massive inequalities in wealth across the global population. And so one response to that is to think, and I'm thinking of Samuel Moyn here, is to think, well, this is a fundamental inadequacy of human rights. Another response is to think, and perhaps we need to move beyond. Another response is to say, no, let's reimagine human rights and make them. This is a tool that we've created. We can create it and improve it and make it meet the problems that we want to solve. Let's change and reimagine human rights so that it can address these deep problems. That would be another response that we could take.
I'd add to that. I mean, the other reason why I think human rights still exists is because the powerful are still dumping on the powerless. So we could reimagine something else, maybe. I mean, but as soon as we start to say that, once you start to say reimagining something else, you always think, well, we've tried that before, and that ended up with really bad for human rights in quite a few contexts. Sometimes it's best if you just stop imagining how we want society to behave and find something else. But one of the baselines on why we still, I think, have human rights and why people will use that discourse, and lawyers, if you look at refugee lawyers who are not cynical in the way that Home Office and government lawyers might or might not be, they might not be too, but are using that law in order to sort of like change the terms of the encounter between either the humanitarian and the person in distress, or borders, or the law of the sea, or the ethics of recognition. And they're doing that because they've got a toolkit to do it. One of the reasons they keep on doing it is because people, keep on, as I said, oppression keeps on happening. And so, I mean, it's not that human rights are the answer to that, but having a notional idea, however fictional or tenuous or vulnerable, that we think we might have to have some rules of the game here. I think that we're as stuck with that as we are with Adam's sense with, I'm certain we have human rights. I'm certain we have human rights because I'm certain we have something like evil too.
I'd like to move us on to thinking about the value of rights as a way of thinking ethically about non-humans. So Yoriko, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about animal rights and whether that's the best mode for thinking about sort of ethical relations with the non-human.
Yes, you probably know what you can guess what I'm going to say already, but let me talk about my favorite topic for a little bit. So at the turn of the millennium, there was an abandonment by mainstream philosophical scholarship of the idea that consciousness is unique to humans. And so with this shift in the philosophy of consciousness emerged these two different approaches to legislating the animal. There's the welfare approach, and then also less mainstream, a rights-based approach that sees animals as sentient beings who should be protected through designated legal rights. This isn't entirely new because there is a really fascinating long history of animals having legal rights because they're recognized as legal people and they have standing in court and so on. This is in the Middle Ages, but post the modern age, we have these two different approaches to legislating animal life, non-human life, and that's welfare and rights. Now, this introduction of awareness about animals needing protection of sorts achieved much of what first and second wave feminism and queer theory and race studies and human rights discourse have achieved, and that's some contestation of the hierarchies of violence that would otherwise operate unquestioned. And this is what Adam and Lyndsey are saying, is like, is one of the real value of keeping this idea of human rights in play. Now, welfare and rights approaches to legislating the animal, however, are based on this humanist ethical theory, which is haunted by deep anthropocentrism. And rights approaches have perpetuated an identity politics that at best leads to an endless exercise in line drawing, with, for example, great apes being granted more rights than, say, rabbits, who receive more mention in laws than worms, and so on. It's problematic because most animals are and there always have been unknown to modern science. So this is the laws that we have only take into account animals that are real. Their probable existence is calculated by statistical method. So of the real animals, both known and unknown, the matter of scale and capacity and visibility is usually conveniently overlooked in laws that impact animals. I'll give you an example of a wonderful animal, the tardigrade. So the tardigrade is a microscopic animal. It's also known as a water bear or moss piglet that's been around for 520 million years. And it has a phylum of 1,250 different species. And some of these species can survive temperatures from 1 degree warmer than absolute zero to minus 272 degrees Celsius. Other tardigrades can endure powerful radiation. And in 2007, the space agency, the European Space Agency, sent 3,000 of these animals into low Earth orbit and space, and they survived for 12 days on the outside of the space capsule. They can live in water, on land, and survive crushing pressures. And without water, they use a protein to create a rigid internal skeleton, and they freeze their own cells, and they can be rehydrated back to life 30 years later in this state. And physicists postulate that tardigrades could survive the 4.37 light year trip to Alpha Centauri. And yet that animal doesn't come close to being acknowledged in animal laws or animal rights laws, because they're neither food nor pests nor trophy, which are our key concerns as humans. And if they were recorded rights, I mean, what would happen then? So the animal really, as it appears in laws as we currently have them, is almost invisible. If we're to try and understand how non-human animals are portrayed in law today, we can see that they play these handful of very just symbolic roles. They're beast or vermin or interloper or sovereign even. And as beasts, they're cast as meat for food or for work. We use the term beastliness to talk about criminals or sexually deviant humans. We talk about vermin, that describes animals that seek to profit from that seek to profit themselves from the fruits of human labor. And I talked about sovereign power. So some animals have this kind of symbolic capital associated with sovereign power because they're hunting trophies, and those kinds of creatures, bears, tigers, and so on, tend to become the focus of being protected or endangered, listed endangered species. So they really are part of this post-colonial imaginary that dominates the way in which our environmental laws, full stop, but animal laws in particular, are drafted today. So these are, the animals that we have in law are these very peculiar inventions of juridical minds that capture the pathos and terror and love of humans for animals and for their parts. And that is, I find fascinating as literature or as an artifact, but it shouldn't really be confused as being sort of real protection for animals themselves. So I think that when people imagine animal rights in the abstract, they're thinking about something far more far-reaching and general than the law has traditionally offered in the way of rights. And they're imagining, I believe, emancipation for non-human animals, some degree thereof, maybe better lives, kindness and treatment, even standing in court. So this is admirable, of course, and I agree with the sentiment. But it's not what we see being played out in the law. And so here are some other problematic things about animal law. So the phrase animal rights presupposes this hierarchical idea of animals as being first beneath humans, subject to their dominion, and second, humans as being not animals, so humans as being not only above, but outside of animal life altogether, which again comes back to what I was saying about us needing to hold on to this idea of humanness in the wake of the end of the rule of the church, and as that as being driven by this deep anxiety. And so we cannot really consider ourselves to be animals, lapse that distinction, because that's essentially what's holding us together as an existential community at the moment, or holding some of us together. There are, of course, many communities who live otherwise, and that's what I'm really interested in finding more about. There's a wonderful scholar called Dinesh Wadawel who talks about the sovereign dominion of non-human life, particularly with regard to animal welfare laws that function, he says, not as a means to reduce the suffering of animals, but on the contrary, as a means of governing it. And this description he gives really neatly encapsulates for me the problem with animal laws in general, and animal welfare laws. So if we talk not just about animal rights laws, but animal welfare laws, which you think, well, surely must be good. Again, this tends to be, a chicken has the right to live in a box of this size, to lay an egg once or twice a day, to be fed this kind of food. But a chicken does not have any access to the rights that we take to be absolutely fundamental: the right to life, the right to family life. And it really boggles the mind when you think about what the welfare we afford animals through law really entails. They are conditions of servitude, and the conditions of their exploitation. So so we could ask the question differently. How does law intersect with the ways in which our society invents, creates, manages animal life? I mean, that's one way into starting to think critically about animal law. And how does law affect the ontological, the ethical, the ceremonial relation between humans and animals?
So it seems as if you're suggesting, Yoriko, that actually what animal rights or the formalization of animal rights in law sort of looks like it's doing is protecting animals, but what it's doing is reinforcing human mastery in a different way.
Yes, absolutely. To me, it does seem that way, and it's dispiriting because, of course, I support all of the efforts that go into trying to make animal lives better, but working in public interest law, for instance, or campaigning for the increase in the square meterage of the barn in which the pigs are shackled. It's so terribly depressing when you put that into a proper context, when you think about what the pig might actually want or might need, which is not to be separated from her young, which is not to see her young being brutally murdered as soon as they're of an age, and to not be living in a barn, and to not be being reared for bees, and to not being used as a factory for the production of food for humans who don't need that protein to survive. And so yeah, it's quite dispiriting. There are many other ways, I think, of approaching.
I wonder also whether one thing that this conversation around animal rights might help us think about is the question of rights a bit more generally, and sort of might offer a sort of interesting critical angle on rights by thinking about, I suppose, the limitation of rights to thinking about humans as individuals, as discrete rational units, rights being incredibly transactional, thinking about, as I say, individuals rather than communities, whether this kind of conversation that's going on in animal studies between sort of the rights tradition and sort of more progressive ways of thinking might sort of we might bring that back into these bigger conversations around rights.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful academic called Matthew Kalako, if anyone's interested, who's writing really helpfully on this topic. But I mean, one thing that the philosopher Martin Heidegger said is that the animal is poor in world, meaning that non-humans couldn't pass any relation to speech or to death or to truth, these really important things. But I think that given that our existential taxonomies really denude our relationship to speech, to death, to truth, a relationship that non-humans have perhaps actually better retained, it may be more accurate to say that the human is poor in world. And so yeah, I totally agree with you, Danielle, in that thinking critically about animal rights and animal law really does open up the problems with discourses of human rights, but also the possibilities that brings up to thinking about human communities and human as animal human communities, with some kind of relation to nature, which I think we have to try to strive for, given the situation that we're in today with environment, in this environmental catastrophe.
I'm aware that we are getting quite short of time, and I have a lot of questions from the audience that have come in. So I wonder if I could put some of those to our panel. So question from David Hidalgo, who's at the University of Milan. What about incommensurability and incompatibility among different human rights? Anyone want to take that on?
I mean, I'll just say something perhaps. I don't know if I would frame it as incommensurability. I'm sure there are some rights that are deeply incommensurable with the fulfillment of other rights. But anytime you have a system of rights, so meaning multiple rights, all of which you have to respect, fulfill, observe, and these are reasonably demanding rights, as they are in the case of human rights, you're going to get resource competition. So, the more you put into, good policing, will take away from money you could have put elsewhere, for instance, into housing and healthcare, et cetera. So there's no way to solve these conflicts. And it is just going to be a challenge, I think, for any government, even if we look at the human rights obligations that states are bound to now, to manage it all and put it all in balance and manage it satisfactorily. So conflict is inevitable in between rights and between even human rights, and I think that's just something you have to sort of roll with and make the best of as someone committed to human rights, or a state committed to human rights in the to and fro of actual governance.
Just to add to that, although I'm so enamored of the tardigrades, I want to get back to the tardigrades at some point. But yeah, I think in terms of that incompatible and incommensurate, I think the problem is when states and political systems think it is a question of management, i.e. not a question of ethics, not a question of politics. And that seems to be where human rights really does seem to crash, because it becomes a question of managing incompatible rights. And so, I mean, I get quite alarmed when rights are spoken of in that way. And the memory I had, as both Yoriko and you were talking, Adam, was the moment when Adolf Eichmann says, who was, as he a self-described bureaucrat, although we do know he was quite a bit more than a self-described bureaucrat, but as an actual very committed anti-Semite and Nazi activist. But within what he said was, I'm a very good administrator. I'm also not a crime. I'm not a criminal. I believe in humanity. I was the one who reduced the number of people in the cattle trucks that were allowed when I was in charge of transportation. So that your analogy with the cow, thinking, well, thank you very much, but I'd rather not be in the cattle truck at all, struck clangingly and hopefully awkwardly at that point.
Thanks, Lyndsey. Another question. This one is from Bernadette Buckley, who's the convener of the MA in Art and Politics at Goldsmiths. She's interested in the relationship between rights and moral sentiment. So she's particularly interested in the enduring perceived correlation between rights, sympathy/empathy, and reflective concerns today. My own interest, she says, is that these qualities of empathy and matters of concern are very much at the core of many art practices. So does the panel have anything to say about this relationship between rights and art or activist practices?
Can I take? I think it was beautifully illustrated. I'm going to go back to the tardigrade by Yoriko telling that story, because what she did was tell the story of another species, and we were all captivated to the point where, I don't know if empathy, certainly in terms of interest, and that yet. So of course, storytelling. I'm very suspicious of empathy, because if you look at the kind of language of moral sentiment as it came out in the 18th century, and the language of empathy today, it is also a power relationship. It's very easy. It's very easy to give good feelings, and much more difficult to give your taxes or withdraw from certain practices or give up some of your own rights. And I think, in those people who criticized the neoliberalization of rights and criticized the production of empathy within that, I think that's something that needs to be taken very seriously. And I think, I'd quite like us just to stop using the word empathy for a little while, and find a new vocabulary for what it is when we imagine other lives in relationship to our own lives, our richer vocabulary. Having said all that, part of the argument I've been making for years is, and it's sort of kind of Kantian, is the imagination is absolutely crucial to the development of ideas around rights and ethical obligation. Partly, in terms of judgment. I mean, the point about being good at art, bad art obviously doesn't create empathy, it just creates boredom. The point about good art is it does give you positions on which to view the world that might not be available to you because your brain's too muddled and you're too tired, or because you're not that particular artist, but become available to you through the work of art, which is then put in a place which is not just that of individualism, but is that of a kind of public space. So yes, absolutely, I think the imagination and the creative arts in particular have crucial position. I mean, if you work with people who are doing human rights activism in countries which do not invest in the arts and humanities, that they will, those are the things that people will be asking for, because they know there's a relationship between the arts, humanities, and rights. And also, as I said before, anyone who is committed to rights should be very alarmed when if you're in a state or country where name no names, arts and humanities departments are being reduced and people are being made redundant. Hello, goldsmiths. You ought to be very, very suspicious and very, very worried about that. So yes to imagination, yes to the arts, but I really would like a more textured and granulated sense of what work the imagination and production of art, production of different forms of imagining can do in terms of our ethical obligations and imaginations of each other.
Great. I think we've got time for one more. So this is from Beth Watts, who is a social policy academic at Heriot-Watt. She asks, if commitment to / belief in, oh, I've lost my page. If commitment to or belief in human rights entails this leap of faith and optimism, what are the implications of the fact that some people are human rights skeptics? Don't we need to step away from a reliance on the idea of human rights as a primary discourse so we can build coalitions that are as wide as possible for our aims?
Yeah, if I may, I think you're absolutely right. I'd agree with that. I think we need to dig deep and look at ancient stories. We need to look at old jurisprudence, minor histories, indigenous laws, other communities outside of the global north. We need to look at children's perspectives to collect really useful ideas about how we might then move on to live together as communities. We have to make a sort of quite dramatic break from the way that we have been living and talking about how we govern ourselves, because it's a broken system, isn't it?
One final question, which I think builds on that quite nicely. This is from Valentina Contreras, who's at the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in Chile. To what extent do you think that the human rights discourse can account for other subjectivities different to the individual human, which are needed for the human to have human rights? I'm referring to the environment and biodiversity in particular. We've got 2 minutes to answer this one.
I think it's a great question. It was also provoked by some of the things that Yoriko was saying, but I was thinking there of, the kind of truth when Marx talks about species being has been, demonstrated in the past 18 months in what it actually means to be one species among many in terms of what can happen on that. But then as soon as I get enamored about that idea, I sort of think there's something, again, it goes back to Adam's point about, I'm certain that there's something like human rights, is I don't really want to construct a kind of epistemology or a rights-based system based on species being. I find that quite troubling, which is a roundabout way of saying, I don't know, but it is the question that we need to be asking now.
Any other brief thoughts on this one from our other panelists?
Just a small point that I don't think the idea of human rights or human dignity need to be in any way prejudicial against other animals. So when we speak about human rights, I think we're talking about the rights of humans. We speak about human dignity, we're speaking about the dignity of human beings. But there's nothing in that that suggests that there might not be the rights of other animals, or indeed of inanimate objects, or dignity of other animals, and dignity of the world, the earth, Mother Earth, the universe. So I think it's just, I hear sometimes people seem to assume that the idea of human rights is exclusionary to other animals. I don't think it has to be. Sometimes it's used that way, but I don't think we need to assume that it always needs to be.
I wish we had more time on that question, because I think it's really interesting. Unfortunately, I think we have run out of time. I'm so sorry if I didn't reach your questions. Thank you for all of the interesting questions we had. Thank you so much for coming along, and thank you to our panelists. Do join us again for other forum events in future.